Namaste. In this course we had a look at a number of situations, and a number of those situations are crisis situations. So for instance, if you have a protected area to manage and if there is an oil spill, it is a situation of crisis. If there is a disease outbreak, it is a situation of crisis. If because of climate change we have a situation of drought or floods into our protected areas, they also become situations of crisis. If there is a heavy poaching in our area, that is a crisis situation. If there is a forest fire into our area, that is also a crisis situation. So there are a number of crisis situations that have to be dealt on a day-to-day basis when we are managing a protected area for the conservation of wildlife. Now in this lecture we will have a look at one such crisis situation that occurred in the Sariska Tiger Reserve. Now Sariska Tiger Reserve is a tiger reserve in the state of Rajasthan, and in the year 2004 it turned out that there were no tigers left in the tiger reserve because of a number of factors. There were quite a number of tigers that were poached away. There were some tigers that were not born because of excessive disturbance into these areas, because of which the tigers did not have cubs in the area, and so on. Now why did we reach a situation of this crisis? So for instance, if this tiger reserve had say 20 tigers, and when this number came down to 10, why was this not taken as a symptom of alarm? Why did we reach a situation in which we had absolutely no tigers left? So there was a very concrete level crisis that was there in the area which had to be handled. And then how did we handle this situation? So we will take this Sariska Tiger Reserve as a case study to understand how a crisis comes, how it unfolds, and then how it is brought back into control, and then what are the consequences that happen. So let us begin. Crisis and learnings, the Sariska case study. Let us begin with a brief description of Sariska. So Sariska Tiger Reserve is located in the Alwar district of Rajasthan. It was earlier a hunting preserve of the Alwar state, and later on it was declared as a wildlife reserve. In 1978 it became a tiger reserve. So this was one of the early tiger reserves of the country. So where is it located? It is here. So this is our state of Rajasthan, and here is our Sariska Tiger Reserve. Now if we look at its geography, it has a very large area. There is 1213.342 square kilometers, which is divided into core of 881 square kilometers and a buffer region of 332 square kilometers. It is a dry area. It is in Rajasthan, so it is a dry area. The average annual rainfall is around 650 millimeters. Topographically, the area is comprised of subthorn arid forest, rocky landscapes, dry deciduous forests, rocks, grasses, hilly cliffs, making it a region with patches of forest separated by some non-forest areas. So essentially what we are looking at here is an island within an island. So in this protected area we have some patches of forest, and then there are some areas which do not have forest, but mostly they are rocky landscapes. The altitude varies between 300 and 722 meters above the sea level, making for an undulating landscape. So it is not a level area. So this is how it looks from when we look at a satellite image. So as you can observe, all this this red area is the Sariska Tiger Reserve. Everything around it is practically barren. It does not have a lot of forest, and even inside this tiger reserve we have these patches of dense forest, and we have these patches where we do not have much of trees left. If we look at a land cover classification, we will get a very similar picture. So here also the green color is representing the dense forest, the white color is representing non-forest, the blue color is representing the sources of water. So we have very few sources of water inside. Then we have scrubs represented by the pink area, and open forests that are represented by the yellow areas. Now open forests are those areas in which you have a very less tree density, probably because there is some amount of tree cutting going on, or probably also because the land is not good enough to support a high density of trees. Now if we look at a 3D model, we will see that there is quite an undulating topography. So for instance, if you have to move from this point to this point, you will have to overcome all of these ups and downs, hilly areas. So it is a very undulating topography. Now this reserve has a very heavy footfall of tourists. So this is a very important reserve of the country, especially from the tourism point of view. Now why do we see a very heavy footfall of tourists? Because of its closeness to Jaipur, which is the state capital, and Delhi, which is the national capital. Now this is a part of the Aravalli range and the Kathiawar Gir dry deciduous forest ecoregion, and you also have a number of minerals that are found in this area. So, minerals include copper and marble, and so there was quite a lot of illegitimate mining in the past. Now, this area has a very large diversity of animals, including tiger, leopard, jungle cat, caracal, striped hyena, and so on. You also have a number of bird species, so which also act as pull factors when we talk about tourists. Also, when we talk about the plant biodiversity, this is also a very hugely diverse area. Now, tourist attractions, it is not just the tiger reserve that is attracting the tourists, but also the Kankwadi fort. Now, this is one fort that is inside the tiger reserve, and the Sariska palace, Nilkant, Gopinath, and Pandupol temples. Now, Pandupol temple is one of the most famous temples, or one of the very famous temples of this area, and also observes a very heavy religious tourist footfall, and also the ruins of Bhangarh. So, this area is not only important from our conservation point of view, but also from the heritage point of view, and also from the religious point of view. Now, timings, so this reserve is open from September to June. In the months of July and August, because that is the breeding season for a number of animals, so this reserve is kept closed to tourists. The months of April, May and June are very hot, though good sightings can be had. Now, winter timings from October to February are 7 am to 4 pm, and for the rest of the year are 6:30 am to 5 pm. Now, given that this area is one of the very important areas, given that we see a very heavy tourist footfall, so we could have utilized the data from tourists also for our management purposes. So, for instance, if there are tourists that are getting into our area and then they are coming out, we can always ask them what did they see, what did they observe. And also, in every vehicle there is a guide who is a departmental person. So, that guide can also be entrusted with this responsibility, that if there was any tiger sighting, now every tiger can be identified using the stripes on its body, and most of the guides have very vernacular names for those tigers. So, they could call it as Munna or Raja or say Shahanshah and things like that. Now, when these guides are able to identify our tigers, we can use their information. So, whenever there was any tourist sighting of a tiger, the guide was also there. So, the guide also identifies that tiger, and then we can ask the guide which all tigers did he or she observe. Now, that information can be used for management purposes, but as we can see from this graph, here we are seeing the direct sightings. So, this is what the tourists observed over the years. So, this curve is going from 1997 till 2014. Now, what we can see here is that here we have the number of tigers. This is the cutoff of 10. Now, if we do not consider this point, so this could be an aberration, but overall what we can observe is that in the year 1997 we observed like 5 tigers. Then later on this value even went down to 4, then 3, then 2, and then in the year 2002 there was no sighting of tigers whatsoever. In 2003 we had reports of 1 tiger sighting, so that could be a tiger sighting or that could also be a false alarm. But then if you look at this trend, it is very clear that we are observing a declining trend, and from this point onwards there were no tigers that were observed in this area, and 2004 is when the crisis unfolded. Now, if we have a look at this graph, these are the departmental estimates, or what was estimated by the forest department. Now, how do we estimate the number of tigers in an area? These days we go for a capture recapture method. So, in that case you install a number of camera traps into your area. Whenever a tiger comes in front of it, so the picture is taken. From that picture and looking at the stripes, you can see which was this tiger. You can identify the tiger, and then as we had done our experiment on chanas in this class, so we had taken some chana and then we had marked those, and then we had left it into the box again, and then we moved that jar and then took out all those chanas again, and just observed which all chanas were there that were marked and then which were unmarked. Now, a very similar thing happens in the case of camera trap experiments as well. So, for every tiger you can make a list of the days on which this tiger was observed. So, for instance, this is how it would look. So, you have tiger 1. So let us call it that this 1 is the ID of the tiger, and then you have the days. So day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Suppose this experiment was done for 10 days. Now this tiger was seen in first day, then on the second day, then it was not seen on these 3 days, then it was also observed on this day, and then on these 2 days. Similarly for tiger 2, we would have that it was observed on day 1, not on day 2, then 3, 4 it was observed, then not on day 5 or 6, then on 7 it was observed, and then not any further. So similarly for each and every tiger, so till tiger n, we can make this chart. So probably this tiger was only observed on the first day and maybe one other day. Now when we have this information, we can make two kinds of deductions. One, because these tigers were photographed in the area, so the minimum number of tigers that are there in the area is equal to this number of n, because these are what we observed in our 10 days of observation. So we have a minimum of n tigers. Now like for any other organism, we will have a capture probability for these tigers. Now how do we compute a capture probability using this data? So when we have this data, we make this assumption that because we captured this data for a very short period, it was only 10 days, so there was no migration of the animals, so none of our tigers moved out, none of the tigers came into our system, because it was a very small time, so it was literally a snapshot. And then this is normally taken in those periods when these tigers are not giving out cubs, so essentially you do not have any new tiger that is being born into the area. And in this 10 days period, we also take this assumption that no tiger would have died, because again it is a very small time frame, so it is literally a snapshot. Now in this case, our tiger 1, it was present on all of these days, but then we detected it on only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 days. So we detected it for 5 days, so the capture probability for this tiger would be 5 by 10. Similarly, the capture probability for tiger 2 would be 1, 2, 3, 4, it is 4 by 10. And for this tiger, its only capture probability is 2 by 10. So similarly for every tiger, we can come up with a capture probability, and then when we put all of this data into our numerical models, we can come up with a range of tigers that are there. So we will say that there are n number of tigers, because n is a number that we have already observed, and then you could have plus a range of numbers. So say plus 2 to 3 more tigers that could be there depending on our capture probability. So that is something that we have figured out using our computations, but n number of tigers are definitely there. Now this is something that we are using these days. So most of our tiger estimations these days are based on camera trapping method. Now in the earlier days, so when we are talking about Sariska, the earlier method was using pug marks. Now what is a pug mark? So when there is a tiger and that is moving in the forest, so whenever it puts its foot somewhere, so there is a mark. If the soil underneath is soft, it has dust, so it will give out an impression. Now this impression would be called a pug mark. So when we have, so for instance in the case of human beings, we would observe this to be the pug mark for one of our feet or one of our hands. Now in the case of tigers, we would observe a pad region, and also we would observe the toes. Now just like in our case, all of us have very different fingerprints, so just by looking at fingerprints, we can identify the individual, or we can at least identify that there were 2 individuals or there were 3 individuals, depending on whether for all our front footprints or the handprints, were they all of them were same or were all of them different. So we can at least make a deduction about the number of individuals that were there. So for instance, if this is a material, I touched it and then somebody else came and that person also picked it up, so there would be thumb impressions, and now we will be able to observe that these 2 thumb impressions are different. So there are at least 2 persons that held this piece. Now similarly in the case of tigers, we can make deductions using their pug marks. But then just like the study of fingerprints is a very intricate art, not everybody can observe that that these two fingerprints are the same or different. Similarly, in the case of tigers as well, it is a very intricate art and it needs to be practiced a lot. Now, if you do not practice it enough, so what would happen is that in the case of this example, I picked it up say 4 times. So now there are 4 thumb impressions, 4 fingerprints of the thumb that are there on this item. Now, if there is a person who is not very adept at reading the fingerprints, he or she might say, oh, these are 4 different thumb marks, so there were 4 people that had picked up this item, whereas in essence there was only one person. So similarly, that is what happens when you use the pug mark method. So pug mark method leads to a very gross overestimation of the numbers. So for instance, at this point when we had say around 5 or say 4 tigers here in the park, the estimate was close to around 25-26. So this was a very gross overestimation. At the same time, if there is a trend, so if we are observing that there are say 25-26 tigers and they have been there for the past say 6 years. So for the past 6 years this trend has been 25 or 26. Now suddenly if somebody says no, this number is not 25-26, this is actually 5. So in that situation there would be a very heavy amount of scrutiny regarding what actually happened, and then people would want to set up a responsibility that in whose tenure these tiger numbers came down, why did they come down, was the protection level adequate or not, and so on. So there are some people who want to avoid such sorts of situations because they become embarrassing for the park. So that could also be another reason why these numbers were not re-evaluated. But then the primary reason was that we did not have a method to actually see how many tigers are there in the park, because the state of the art method in those times was the pug mark method, and that was not accurate. So now if we look at the analysis of the situation, we would observe that the population estimation varied a lot with different agencies. So when we talk about the park administration, they were always maintaining the status quo figure of 25-26 tigers, but the estimate that was brought through direct sightings, it kept on reducing with time, and after a while it came to 0. Now this difference between 25-26 tigers and 5 or 6 tigers should have been strong enough, a strong nudge to review and renew the estimation procedures, but then this opportunity was allowed to get lost. But then this was also because we did not have much research into this area, and so we did not have better methods. And these novel methods such as camera trapping were not deployed, despite evidences that not only were these methods vastly superior to the pug mark method, but also that the pug mark method was rife with issues. But then another problem with the camera trapping method was that in India we did not have much experience with these methods. So most of our camera trapping devices even today are imported from abroad, and so if we talk about our frontline staff, there are very few number of people that are very adept in using these camera traps. But even then it can be argued now with the hindsight that if we had a novel method of camera trapping that was better, then no matter what the cost, we could have given that amount of budget, and then we could have deployed it in the place. Now large standard deviations in the estimates were also allowed to linger. So when we talk about these standard deviations, what we are talking about is the precision of the results. So when we say that there were 25-26 tigers, now this is the midpoint, but then what was the standard deviation? So if we say that standard deviation was say 25 plus minus 15 tigers, so this estimation does not make any sense, because with this value I can say that there could be 10 tigers or there could be 40 tigers. So in that case, if we have a very large standard deviation, it means that our results are not precise, and if our results are not precise, then as people with statistics background, we can say that we need to improve on our methods. The analysis, the prediction strategy was relying a lot on the deployment of staff, but it did not have state of the art technological interventions. The staff was aged, inefficient and untrained, so protection was not that effective. They were also leaving their posts during the monsoon season, which was exploited by the poachers. And then in the absence of amenities, infrastructure and equipment, and also policies that did not provide any immunity over the use of firearms, there was hardly anything that the staff could do. And also there was great amount of antagonism between the department and the locals, because these locals wanted to get into the forest, clear off lands, take up timber from the forest, maybe divert these lands for agriculture or grazing, because we saw in one of the earlier pictures, the satellite image, that we have only this small Sariska Tiger Reserve, and everywhere else there is hardly any forest left. So there was a huge pressure, and because department was protecting the tiger reserve, so there was a huge amount of antagonism between the locals and the department, because of which if there was any poacher in the area, these people also did not tell the department fellows. And in some cases it also turned out that the villagers actively cooperated with the poachers, because for instance, if you are a villager who is taking say cows into the forest area, there could be a tiger that would come and poach your livestock. Now because ab initio your act was wrong, in a tiger reserve you cannot go inside for grazing, so then there cannot be any compensation that can be paid to you. So the best thing that these villagers thought was that let us get rid of these tigers, if there are no tigers my cattle are safe. So that was the viewpoint in those times. Now if you look at the crisis curve, how did this crisis unfold till the year 2004, and then what happened after the crisis. So for any crisis we can have a curve such as this. So on the y axis we have the crisis intensity, and on the x axis we have the time period. So what we observe here is that the first stage is crisis in gestation. So the crisis has not unfolded so far, but it is brewing inside. So what were the events then? So in 1988 there was a tiger skin seizure from Sansar Chand. The Sansar Chand happens to be one of the most notorious poachers that has ever existed in our country, and we were seizing tiger skins right from 1988. Now these days if there is any seizure of tiger skin, what we do is that we take a picture of the skin and then we compare it with our database, because we are having camera trap database from all of our tiger reserves. So now we can do a one-on-one comparison between the skin that was seized to pinpoint where this tiger was located when it was poached. So if we say get to know that this tiger was at Mudumalai, so that would mean that in the case of Mudumalai we need to put in more amount of force to protect our tigers from poaching. But in those days, because we did not have these data, so this sort of correlation could not be made. Now in 1993 there was seizure of 6 tiger skins, and then we have observed that the tiger numbers continued to remain inflated in the official figures. In 2003 there was again a skin seizure from Sansar Chand. So all that thing was going on before our 2004. Now in 2004 we got some warnings, so which is why this crisis intensity shows a peak. So in 2004 May the official tiger numbers were reduced. So from say around 20-25 tigers we brought it down to around 10-15 tigers, and the field director requested the PCCF, who is the head of the forest force in the state, and the Project Tiger. So in the pre-NTCA days we were having the Project Tiger. So the field director requested both of them for guidance. By September there were students and researchers from the Wildlife Institute of India who failed to find any tiger there. Now this point is also important to note. So we generally have some students, some researchers who are working in our tiger reserves for their own PhDs and also for their research publications. Now if there are any such researchers out there in our forest and they are day in and day out, they are moving with our staff or maybe even separately, they can also be tapped as sources of information. So for instance, if these people had pointed out that these tiger numbers were going down, then that would have been heard. But then even those people failed to report this, or maybe they did not observe all this. But there these official figures had been brought down, WIA students and researchers also said that they could not find any tiger presence. By 2004 December to 2005 January, media started reporting about the poached tigers. So now this was the pre-tremor. Then this crisis was escalated when to a point of no return. So there were two things that happened in 2005 March and April. The CBI was asked to investigate what is happening here, and also the Prime Minister's office created a task force to investigate. Now all the results that we are using in this presentation are coming from the report of that task force. Now when these investigations were happening, we reached a plateau. Now in this investigation, it could also be possible that this was a false alarm. Maybe our tigers had gone and were residing in some cave for instance, so they were not observed. So in that case this crisis would have gone down back again, but then as we can observe from here, the crisis was further escalated. So this is the point we are talking about, 2004. Now in this period, so this is one newspaper report from 12th of June 2004. So again in 2004 there were seizures of a number of leopard skins, and this poacher was again traced back to Sansar Chand, but all this information was not directly used to protect our tigers in the Sariska Tiger Reserve. Now this fifth stage is about secondary tremors and further escalation. So all these reports from the Wildlife Institute of India, the task force that was set up by the Prime Minister's office, and the CBI, all of them confirmed that there are no tigers in Sariska left whatsoever. So then it reached a plateau in which the reports were submitted, and they also contained recommendations, what needs to be done, where did we go wrong, because whenever there is any crisis situation, we need to ask this question, what went wrong, how could we have prevented it, what are we going to do to restore the situation, and also what are the learnings, so that such a crisis does not happen anywhere else. Now we can also say that Sariska crisis, it was not just a crisis but also a blessing in disguise, because just because we lost all of these tigers, we had such a huge amount of investigation that came up, that we came up with all these regulations, we came up with all these guidelines regarding what needs to be done, and since Sariska our tiger numbers are growing. So this was also a blessing in disguise, but then after reaching this plateau, all these recommendations were then implemented, and not only were they implemented, but we also translocated tigers to Sariska to restore that population. So tigers were reintroduced into the area so that our tiger population comes up back again. Now that is the resolution phase, but then whenever a crisis occurs, there is some damage to the reputation, because in this case Sariska became a textbook example of how not to manage a tiger reserve. So this is what happens in any of the crisis situations. Now in any crisis there are a number of turning points. So turning points are those situations where we take a course correction, and where in most situations we take a step in through which it is now possible to get to a very different outcome than was possible before. So like in the case of the gestation period, turning point could have been when all these skins were poached from the Sansar Chand's gang. If this gang was busted, if Sansar Chand could be say put behind bars, and maybe if this network was disrupted, then that could have played a role in not letting Sariska happen. So there were three turning points in this crisis. The first one was the crisis escalation stage. So this was the first turning point that did not happen. So what happened was, the first was during the crisis stage when the Prime Minister's office took cognizance of the matter and pushed for investigations. So this put the whole situation towards a point of no return. So that was the first turning point. If the Prime Minister's office did not take cognizance, then probably we could not have come up with these investigations. The second turning point was when the task force and the different agencies submitted their reports, clearly mentioning the lapses involved and suggesting the future course of action. So this clarified the situation and created an atmosphere where policy and administrative changes could be made. So this was our second turning point. If our investigating agencies did not come up with a good report, then probably Sariska would have continued to happen in different other tiger reserves. And the third turning point was when the suggestions were implemented in the resolution phase. So tigers were translocated and a self-sustaining breeding population created after boosting the safety issues. So this not only put back Sariska into its glorious position, but also became a textbook example for others to emulate. So essentially when we talk about Sariska, it's not only a textbook example of how not to do things, because there were so many things that did not happen properly, but these days this is also cited as an example of what to do when there is a crisis. So if there is any crisis, and if you say put this crisis below a rug, if you do not give it any heed, then it is possible that your crisis may further escalate. So in place of losing your tigers, after a while you would have say lost a number of other animals, maybe you would have lost all your forests and all, and so on. But then because department was able to put its foot down and do all of these investigations, so this also became a textbook example of how to tackle a situation when a crisis happens. You need to go for very clear and unbiased investigations, you need to go for a resolution phase, and you need to bring the situation back into control again. So what are the learnings that we got from Sariska? So these are the learnings that we are now putting in for all of our tiger reserves. So the first is the need for protection. Poachers can strike anywhere, so protection is needed at all times. So now this is one learning because of which we are now putting more and more emphasis for protection. Mere filling of positions is not enough. So in the case of Sariska, we had 301 out of 305 positions that were filled. So Sariska had only 4 vacancies, but the aged staff could not do effective patrolling. So now there is more and more emphasis on the abilities of the staff. So there is more and more emphasis on the training of staff that is going on. Then rationalization of funding. So Sariska had one of the largest funding in the country, but the effectiveness in protecting tigers was low. So from that we came up with a performance auditing. So these days we have a report that is known as Management Effectiveness Index for every tiger reserve. So this is a process that goes on a periodic basis to understand whether all the fundings that have been given to a tiger reserve, what is the outcome that is coming out of the use of all of that funding. Is the protection good enough? Is the habitat good enough? Are tourists good enough, or are tourists satisfied? Is the amount of training sufficient, and things like that are now looked into when we are talking about the Management Effectiveness Index. Then there is a need to revamp technologies. So the pug mark method was reliable, so there was an upgradation of technology and we shifted to the camera trapping method. Then there is a need for keeping channels of communication open. So the letter from director to chief wildlife warden and from the chief wildlife warden to Project Tiger was largely ignored as told in the task force report, and this shouldn't have happened. So now when we talk about our NTCA, that which is the successor to the Project Tiger, these days we regularly have meetings directly with the field directors, so that this channel of communication is kept wide open at all times. Now there is always a need to analyze status quo. The poaching of tigers had not been recognized since ages, since the park officials were determined to maintain the status quo figure of 25 to 26 tigers. This was only reanalyzed when the figures showed a sudden drop, when the analysis could have been made much earlier. So these days, earlier our strategy was that if there is any change in the status quo, then there is a need to investigate what is happening. But these days, even if you are having a status quo, we go for sampling that is done by a third party agency to ensure that that we absolutely have correct figures. Now there is a need for honest reporting of figures and a need to involve tourists etc. in monitoring. So non-sighting of tourists, non-sighting of tigers by tourists should itself have rung an alarm bell, and these days we are making more and more use of our tourists and guides as well. Then there is a need for research to be directed to field level problems, not just towards scientific papers. So the scientific community could have been much more forthright in pointing out the problems than they did. Then there is a need for rapid settlement of rights. In the case of any tiger reserve, the rights of the people are taken up by the government, they are compensated, and then the rights are extinguished. But in this case, the rights of the locals had not been settled, and in certain situations these rights are still in the process of being settled. Now when the rights have not been settled, so people continue to stay in the reserve area, and then when people are already there and when you impose these do's and don'ts, then there is an antagonism that becomes directed towards the tigers or against the tigers, so that they even connive with the poachers. So settlements of rights and relocation of people is now being done on a much more priority basis than was in the pre-Sariska days. Then the need for intelligence, so intelligence has also been revamped. Need for rationalization of policies. So in those days we did not have immunity provisions for the use of firearms. Now these days in some areas people have been explicitly given immunity for the use of firearms, and in certain other situations we are making use of police forces. Now a need for control over habitat degrading activities. Now the heavy presence of mining and grazing pressure degraded the habitat to such an extent that tigers did not breed properly, and this was also an important factor in their decimation, because what happens is that if you have a breeding population of tigers and if there are 4 tigers poached away, but you also have an addition of 10 other tigers in the meantime, so in that case the population continues to survive. But in this case we not only had poaching, but at the same time there were a number of habitat degrading activities because of which the tigers were not breeding. So now we are putting more and more control over these. And then there is also a need to improve habitat productivity and corridor connectivity, because in the case of Seriska, these tigers, once they were decimated, they were not able to come back from some other area. We did not have a very good corridor connectivity. So in that situation, we had to translocate tigers from somewhere else, mostly Ranthambore. So now these days we put a lot of emphasis on maintenance of corridor connectivity and also on increasing the habitat productivity, so that our habitat is able to support a much larger population of tigers. So in this case, what we are referring to is that if we look at the number of tigers, and then there is a carrying capacity that is called K. Now if this is the carrying capacity K1, so what would happen is that after translocation your number of tigers would then start fluctuating around this figure. But then if you increase the habitat productivity so that you reach to another level which is called K2, then in that situation your tiger population would hover something like this. Now if you have a small population, so poaching has a much greater impact on a smaller population than it can have on a larger population. So in that case, the improvement of habitat productivity is also now being taken up in a large manner. So that's all we had to tell today about the crisis situation and then how it is handled. So that's all for today. Thank you for your attention. Jai Hind.